right. Thank you all for joining us for our June sustainability series. We're excited to have Scott here from Hillcrest Village and Community Action Center in Northfield, Minnesota. Hillcrest Village is a net zero energy affordable housing development at the intersection of sustainability and affordability. It provides a mix of emergency housing, supportive housing, and workforce housing in a single financially sustainable development. Scott is a community collaborator, economist, soccer coach, carpenter, trail runner, and parent of 4 children. He is the executive director and will be giving our presentation here today. The Community Action Center, where he focuses on how community systems are built in partnership and collaboration with the participants who access these systems. He oversees programs on food shelves, emergency shelters, carbon offsets, substance abuse supports, community development, and net zero energy construction developments through his role. With that, I will hand it over to Scott to kick off today's presentation. Please feel free to use the chat to ask questions. We'll also have some time at the end for Q&A as well. So thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks for having me. I know I don't get a chance to meet all of you individually, and so looking forward to our discussion at the end. Certainly, if you have questions to put in the chat, certainly that's helpful, and then we'll go back to those at the end. But if you have really important questions you'd like some clarity on a specific slide, I'd welcome if there's an interruption. That's really helpful. No problem at all from my perspective, and then we'll just try to bring it back at the end. I'm gonna just give an overview of what Hillcrest Village is as a project, but then also kind of what CAC is as an organization and how we specifically went about the process of constructing this project. And so from today's perspective, we're going to talk about a little bit about CAC. We're going to talk a little bit about, again, Hillcrest Village, kind of the data process, and then the community engagement process. We'll talk about kind of the affordable housing conversation, and then specifically the environmental solutions that this project has championed. A little bit about just the nitty gritty in terms of construction and how that process went, financing and all the complications with that. And again, you are welcome to engage in any way, whether it's Q&A at the end or if there's something along the way you'd like to discuss more. On the right of your screen, I would like to just bake this whole conversation in this idea that we, especially in the building housing development space, love linear processes. And so this visual is kind of helpful because we all see this and feel a sense of calm around, oh, the data is driving like our community engagement, which drives our housing choices and how we incorporate the environment back to financing, and kind of around and around we go. I think what I just want to make sure we're all thoughtful of is that often this linear perspective can be a little artificial, and in reality, there's a lot of back and forth and integrative kind of intersectional processes in here. So just like community engagement actually sometimes is necessary to inform our data needs. In our process, it became important about the environment. The data needs around housing really started to be important to connect those two things. Housing informed financing in terms of what types of housing we were offering. Financing goes back to community engagement and fundraising. And so you just end up with this classic kind of integrative, multifaceted, multidimensional approach. And so I just hope everybody can kind of embrace that throughout the conversation. And certainly I just want to be real about, in my revisionist history of this project, it can sound really linear and clean, and yet the mess of this will come out multiple times in this conversation. And it's something that we've learned to really embrace. And so first, we're going to talk a little bit about just what is CAC. And so I'll keep this part short because I know for today's conversation, we really want to focus on those kind of environmental solutions we implemented and how they were constructed. And yet this process of community engagement is something that can easily get diminished. And so I'm going to talk about CAC and how we do that. But in short, Community Action Center looks a lot like any type of social services agency. We have programming, food access, housing, which can be shelter to affordable housing, employment support, financial assistance, youth services, clothing, transportation. So these are the typical ways you think about a social services agency. Community Action Center is not a CAP agency, so we're not a community action program. We just sound like one in both name and programming. We're much more of the community-funded nonprofit, kind of birthed from the 1950s, 60s church basement that has grown into kind of a larger social services organization. So in my time here, we conceptually think a lot more about our role as this. We call it the center of community action. So things happening in Northfield and in Faribault and throughout Rice County. So how do we combine and find that intersection of local challenges and local solutions? Which is a different way than the typical program side of, we're going to run a food shelf, we're going to see how much food we can get out in the community. And instead, how does our local community have a role in that challenge? And so the process becomes much more listening and empowering, especially our participants, to kind of inform those programming. And so just this is important when you think about Hillcrest as Hillcrest was not birthed from our typical programming. It was actually birthed from the voice of community members, from environmental activists, construction folks, our participants, people who are experiencing homelessness, engaged members of our employer base around what Hillcrest could be. And it's because of this conceptual shift that our primary role is not to build programs, but to listen to the needs of the community. So we end up with these really wacky kind of programs we run. We do scholarships for community supported agriculture, farms in our area. We do like a growing amount of substance abuse support. Even our hiring practices have changed where our participants, especially like people who have experienced homelessness, actually interview and hire our staff. We don't have like a DEI initiative. Instead, we actually just turn power over in all of our hiring practices to our participants. And it's just a change that's happened within CAC. And because of that change, this is a complicated graph, and don't worry, we won't spend time on it, but just from a scale standpoint, the blue line is really our growth in direct supports around food, clothing, hotels, transportation, rent support over the last 5 years, and with projected into next year. The green is this growth in households we serve in our area. And so just on like a scale size, we now serve nearly 5,000 households, which is 5 times more than we did about 5 years ago. And similarly, we provide about 9 times the amount of support. The reason I bring this up is not to talk about the social services side, but just to recognize the value in nearly a third. So at any given time in any of our locations in a year, we're seeing about a third, maybe 30 to 40% of the entire population of our area is physically within our buildings and accessing services from CAC, whether it's food support, rental assistance, housing navigation. And so in terms of an asset to the community and in terms of providing voice to people who typically don't have a voice in these processes, especially around sustainability or affordable housing, the opportunity to have that captive of an audience in one physical location is really valuable, and it becomes valuable in a lot of ways. And so just in this growth cycle for CAC, we've been able to really prioritize how this kind of value is used for the sake of the built environment, sustainability, climate action, and a lot of other things to make sure this voice is loudly represented in that work. Okay, so what is Hillcrest? Kind of the data needs that drove what it became and the process that we use. So in short, Lauren kind of teed this off. Hillcrest is a net zero energy affordable housing development. It's at this intersection of sustainability and affordability, and it's in Northfield. And specifically, it provides a mix of emergency housing, supportive housing, and workforce housing, and in one financially sustainable development. And so it's self-funded. It doesn't need an infusion of constant grants and other things to function. It provides internal subsidies. And so just on these definitions, net zero energy really meaning the design is such that the actual the units of housing, the amount of energy they use is completely offset by on-site solar. Or will be. Our solar array is still being finalized and constructed here, but the design is actually this net zero side, and we can get into the technical part of that. Emergency housing really meaning there are free housing options for people in crisis. Supportive housing meaning it's really voucher friendly, and so any type of program or voucher people come with, or even some sliding scale housing options are within Hillcrest. And then workforce really meaning we're targeting those people who are employed locally, but because of the housing market can't access housing. And so this really alignment with our employers' needs. And what I mean by community visioned, funded, and constructed project is that it is not built in the way CAC would have built it. We built it in the way the community visioned this to be built. And then specifically, we'll talk about funding. This is largely funded from within the local community, and it was constructed by local contractors and vendors versus different approaches that might have brought in outside entities to kind of fulfill the mission of this net zero energy project. We actually wanted to empower our local builders, community members to be part of it, and that was an important part of this project. So in terms of the need, again, this is just purely on as a nonprofit, we're really passionate about data driving a lot of our solutions rather than solutions on the search for a good problem. And so we started really looking at what are the data-driven needs around people experiencing homelessness, families on our waiting lists, the vacancy rate in the area, which was less than 1% and kind of remains there. Probably a lot of similar stories you hear in your community. We've kind of had grown to spending a lot of money on hotels as an emergency option, which is just financially really hard to sustain. And then one of the realities for Rice County, just in comparison to Rochester, is we're the third most expensive housing district in Minnesota outside of Rochester, and the Twin Cities. And so that makes this kind of unattainable housing access something we really wanted to address. So the short history on this project, it used to be a 1950s motel. You can imagine any like Friday the 13th kind of movie, and you got the right image, especially on a cold fall day with fog rolling in. There's a house on the hill and then little kind of motel units on the side. Long story short, it was foreclosed on in about 2018, and CAC purchased the property and then began kind of stabilizing for the people who lived there and then looking at what a long-term vision was. So from 2019 until we kind of are cutting our ribbon on this thing in a couple of weeks, we have about 4 years of both planning, engagement, and then eventually construction, and it's been operating since about October 1 of last fall. Okay, so all of that to then dive into this process. Our process on Hillcrest, I'll just say, as a social services agency, started with a simple idea of let's get it done. We're worried about people who are homeless. We're worried about people who don't have access to housing. And so our first reaction was much more in the, we need to get housing now. We sense injustice in the fact that people are sleeping on the street or in their car, and so we're going to get it done. And this is a good example of when it was just us as the stakeholder, that made a lot of sense. We did step back and kind of assess, is this the right way to build, and who and what should we be thinking of? And one thing that came up is people started pushing us around, well, shouldn't you do more of a green kind of building? And I would say we fell for the trap of like a greenwashing approach. The joke we always use is we were going to slap a side of solar on the project and call it green. And so we spent a lot of time thinking, oh, how do we make this kind of signaling that it's green, but spending the minimum amount of money to get it done? And I think that took a little while for us and our board and our leadership to kind of wrestle with what that meant versus just getting houses built. But then we actually went through this third round of who are we? And this goes back to the conceptual idea of CAC being this convener, community organizer, aggregate voice for 5,000 households in our community, and thinking, well, who are we is really answered by the people we serve, and what do they think this project should become? And that's when we started down the road of this like integrative design process of including a lot of people. And so this intentionally gets back to my nonlinear approach around, we kind of started with CAC kind of convening a lot of different people from our board, the designers, volunteer community members, solar experts. It kind of grew to starting fundraising with donors. We engaged future residents of people who may call Hillcrest home. We built an environmental design team, and then we started like having systems consultants around geothermal potential, solar, different vendors from mechanical systems. And again, we just kept exploding this to more and more people and voices, from banks to supporters to builders to our climate action plan, the city leaders, partners like the Salvation Army. Like, what does this look like? And I enjoy this slide because it's a little bit of, this is kind of what it becomes at some point, and it can just feel so overwhelming and messy because you have so many voices. And yet, at some point, the real shift for us was becoming comfortable with this, and actually embracing this type of view is really the right way for us to go about our work. And so, again, some of you may be really unsettled by like a Jackson Pollock singularity painting, and yet some of you may find inspiration in it. And I would say we sat in that same kind of tension, especially when you look at development, which is very linear construction plan project management. So quick view of the property. This is the old motel, the old house up on the hill, and then the kind of motel units below. This is the site plan that we developed, just to give you a visual. Here's some recent photos of the houses as they're completed. And this is kind of a hand sketch of the whole site. And so you have these 6 different buildings. You have a solar array up in the upper right, and it's built kind of on this cul-de-sac. And so now we're going to get into both the housing and the environmental kind of technical part, which I'm assuming we'd like to all explore a little more. And so just on a housing perspective, I think one thing, because CAC does have 50+ years of history of serving different people in different capacities around housing, from emergency shelter to domestic violence, people fleeing domestic violence looking for safe housing, to kind of voucher supportive housing with case management, or even just affordable housing, we have come to the conclusion pretty, I would say, uncompromising at this point, that having specific properties with single use and having all people of this type living in this space is not best for people and healing and responding to trauma. And so we prioritized having a diverse community in our development, as in they were not going to be 17 units of emergency shelter. They were also not going to be 17 units of Section 8. we decided that this was going to be a very diverse community with diverse needs that could support each other, build a community that really expanded on what Northfield is and the needs of Northfield. We also prioritize the flexible use. Needs change in the community, and a lot of typical construction process would just say, this is going to be this development, it's going to be this way for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And our knowledge, especially in rural Minnesota, is that those needs change daily, monthly, definitely yearly, and by decades, they can become irrelevant. And so we really prioritize having flexibility to meet the changing needs of the community. And just, I'll kind of try to get back to these funding implications. A lot of mainstream funders, whether it's through tax credits or anything else, really prioritize single use. They also prioritize like tax-centered kind of incentives, and they're relatively inflexible. And so we had this challenge of our priorities and the mainstream funding options weren't always in line. And that's a reality we had to face. So the environment side, I want to spend a little bit of extra time on this before we kind of wind down to the Q&A part. But okay, so I'm going to use this phrase integrative design process. This really was the idea that we brought our environmental architecture team together with our vision and our leaders and our volunteer construction people, as well as some partners from the Center for Sustainable Building Research from the U of M, to kind of grind out, and we use the phrase tightening the screws on these different components, from building envelopes and insulation to thermal bridging issues, mechanical systems, different layouts and orientation to the buildings, how we incorporated renewable energy. And at the end of the day, how much all of this costs and like what were our design goals. And the idea is we really had to go through many models and iterations to try to, we use the phrase again, tightening the screws, but the idea is that we weren't trying to build something that met some certification. We were actually trying to build something that was value addition, a good return on investment, and yet getting the most bang for our buck. And again, buildable at the local level was really important to us. And so we went through kind of all of these different things. And this is where I'll get a little more technical. This is our wall assembly. And for those of you kind of interested in this, certainly you can record your questions and we can come back to this slide later. But we essentially ended up with a design that had a double framed wall. We have a 2x6 exterior wall with what you see with the pink installation, just typical fiberglass. It's 24 on center. And then we have typical exterior cladding. We did not have exterior insulation. We have a 1-inch foam board kind of sandwich on the interior. And then we actually have a 2x4 wall built. And you can see they're jogged so that we don't end up with a thermal bridging issue from exterior to interior, with spray foam in between the 2x4 studs and then typical drywall. And so this wall model was developed through many conversations with scientists, engineers, architects, and specifically our local builders. Because when we put out typical kind of off-the-shelf kind of ideas of panelized construction or other things, a lot of our local builders just weren't comfortable with it. They had never used it. They didn't know how to use it. And so we really looked at what were they comfortable with, what is their subcontractors, what were they comfortable with, and we designed and modeled this wall with all of those parties and stakeholders in the conversation so we could get to something that everybody agreed on, that met our environmental sustainability goals around the design of the buildings as a whole. And so we can come back to this if you'd like, but that's the wall assembly we used on all of our homes or all of the buildings. I want to talk a little bit about some variables that were kind of interesting. Window wall ratios obviously get played out, and we modeled all of these through with the University of Minnesota on how these different ratios impacted our eventual electric usage. And I want to really highlight this orientation impact. So we started playing with spinning the buildings, right? So under what orientation provided the most energy efficient building? And we talk a lot about that sometimes in the design space. But one of the things we learned actually was just based on the general design and what we had constraints for our site plan. You see at the bottom, the site energy usage, depending on what orientation we oriented the buildings, changed very little. It became kind of a moot point, and we said it was approximately 10% at most, and that we actually found a lot more value rather than changing the whole site plan and changing the whole layout of the development. There was much better places to invest our time, energy, and money than specifically the orientation. Again, one of the things I was fascinated about this project is bringing all these stakeholders and partners together. We could make these decisions based on data and modeling, not based on, well, my grandpa built a home and he got a lot of solar gain from that. Like we got away from anecdotes and we really got back to, this is what the models say that we will get, and we're going to drive decisions that way to get the most value for the project. Again, extra details here, but we found, I would say, surprising to me as somebody from the outside. I had been a builder, I had been a contractor, but never at this level. We found a lot of value in the slab and in insulating the slab and the footings. And so these are just some images of different models. So like if you typically, put an exterior insulation on your foundation down to the footing, and then you have this blue is this, I forget the actual inches, but a few inches of insulation underneath the slab. We modeled out like how much heat transfer happens here and how much heat loss is there versus we found a design of just incorporating some extra insulation in these first, 3 feet or so, and actually eliminated by multiple factors how good the insulation could be at that level, just on some of these very small technical changes. And found a lot of value in looking at these thermal bridging pieces and the building envelope about where we could get the most bang for our buck and where we could start changing some basic design. Heating systems, water heaters, etc. I won't spend a lot of time on these. These get very much into unit specific things, but the big takeaway was that because we invested in the wall assembly and the building envelope, we actually were able to downsize all of our mechanical systems. You can almost heat the units with a candle. And so what you don't need is this robust like geothermal system, because to be honest, we could never get the return on investment because we needed so little from the geothermal system. What we actually found was while we went down a lot of roads like geothermal, we found again the value of investing in large returns on investment, building envelope, preventing thermal bridging issues, allowed us to get more typical, normal kind of mechanical systems. And yet investing in some unique ideas, like there's this, it's too small to see in your screen, but this drain kind of heat recovery system of preheating all the water that goes to the water heater, preheating it by wrapping it around the drain pipe in all the buildings so that you can preheat water before it goes, and kind of recovering the heat that's lost from water you've already heated and has gone down the drain in your shower or bathtub or anything like that. And so how we incorporated some of those designs really helped with the efficiency. And so what I'll highlight here is that we looked at, we could do a good practice, we could do better practices, or this kind of FIAS, like Passive House Institute of US design. And what we did, you see in blue, is we started value selecting. We optimized what made the most sense for our project based on our needs in the community, based on the skill and talent and knowledge of our local contractors, and how we could get to a conclusion that made the most sense. And so our net conclusion here is about a 62% reduction in energy. Specifically, you can see in red is the typical kind of, this would be a good new construction above code, what we kind of standardized as what a typical builder developer would build in our area. And we were able to see a massive reduction, especially in space heating is where we found the most. And the idea again being investing in the building envelope was the place we found the most return. But a 62% reduction, again, we didn't quite go for the FIAS model, which would have been down to this kind of level of how much KBT used. But again, 62% is a really big improvement. We saw that that was the best place for us to land. Okay, so just to kind of recap that environmental thing, we talked a lot about the energy efficient kind of net zero perspective. One thing I didn't mention is that with all electric being produced with on-site solar, and we have a two-way meter with Xcel Energy, so we can fluctuate as needed seasonally. We actually have zero natural gas on site. There are no fossil fuels, and so everything is an entirely electric development. That was really important for us so that we could source everything from renewable energy. And then the other thing is we really prioritize those savings in energy use and costs being experienced by our tenants, as in they are the ones who benefit from the energy savings. And so the other side of it, just as locally engaged, we wanted to make sure this was all buildable at the local level. And then the other piece of how we did this was that we really wanted to change both policy and practice. And so the way we didn't just demand that something had to be done, we actually spent time and energy and resources and hired people to be alongside the builders to make sure they could support and educate like how these changes are done and how these environmental designs are implemented. And it wasn't just a requirement, it was a requirement with a lot of support and incentive. And I'll get more to that in a little bit. But I think this quote from one of our main builders, just that he'd previously been skeptical about all this affordability of constructing energy efficient homes, but that throughout the process, he had a change of mind and perspective and a paradigm shift. and can change the way he builds in the future. Again, I find the construction industry, and some of you may be from this, really interested in, or maybe hyper prioritizing lessons learned over decades and decades or centuries of building practices. And that's very reasonable given that industry. And yet including everyone in the process and the learning environment provided opportunities to build at a different level. All right, I'm gonna keep moving. And so just how did we construct this? We used a project management team, again, from this local perspective that's really important. And so just to this site design, we had 3 builders. You'll see Northfield Construction Company, which has been renamed NCC Builders, but Schmidt Homes and Johnson Ryland, and then our solar partner is Novel Energy. And so different builders built different home types or building types. And so we ended up with one construction lead. Northfield Construction Company was the single point contract and did the site work and development work, but then subcontracted with each builder, including themselves, to build individual homes. The reason we did that is that we wanted to get through the project and support people in a way that changed the local building landscape. It did not just create a successful project. And so the idea is we now have 3 of our larger builders in the area who know how to build practically and have experience building net zero energy homes. And that was a really important investment for us. And one of the things that happened is we had to bring 3 competitors together and really talk about these principles around sharing pricing and having transparency and like how people were pricing things, and then created an atmosphere for 3 otherwise competitive builders to problem solve together. So how do you get this, double wall construction to work with your window and the window jam and acoustically caulk everything appropriately so that you get the right rating and pass all the tests from the blower door test to all the installation tests and everything like that. And so how they could learn together was really important. We obviously spent a lot of time unifying everybody on the mission from CAC's role of who are we in the community and how do we work together. And then we did, especially navigating COVID, we did some shared sourcing around cabinets and windows, just because at the end of the day, these are rental properties. And so CAC owns them and we have some common interest, even though we have different builders, we still want some consistency across our buildings. And so just a highlight of interest, CAC was named a Builder of the Year from Xcel Energy just a few months ago for 2022. It's an interesting honor when all the other award winners were custom multi-million-dollar custom home builders, and yet Community Action Center, I just found it, I find the humor and the irony that we built emergency shelters and workforce housing and were named a Builder of the Year from the top electric saver. And again, by spending the time in the process and the design, we were able to match some of the state's leading builders, and certainly a odd new trophy on our side of something we're pretty excited about. So I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of financing just so people can engage in that, and then leave it open for Q&A as much as people would like to talk about. So just budget and costs. Again, I'm happy to be as transparent about any of this. We would share kind of any information and are kind of actively sharing with different partners about what this cost us. But we have site development costs of about $650,000. There's about $3.8 million for our buildings. Then there's a lot of landscape, solar, all kind of miscellaneous things I looped into one. So we're a little over $5 million at $5.25, which does come out per unit. There's 6 buildings, 17 units. It's about $309,000, which is not on the low end in terms of per unit. Again, all the buildings are either twin home or duplexes or triplexes. We have 2 quadplexes that actually have 4 units in each building. And so that price can fluctuate between how many bedrooms are in each unit. But 309 is relatively expensive, and yet kind of at the end of the day, navigating through the COVID market, we thought we were actually pretty successful in that. And with the complete site development cost side of this, is actually pretty reasonable from today's costs and our perspective. I did want to share the 2 kind of conclusions we came to in the postmortem was that we did have our builders bid the designs without all the environmental aspects and then to compare actuals after the fact. And so we do see the total environmental premium. This would be the mechanical systems, the extra insulation, the double wall, and some of all these little choices. We saw about a 7 to 8% increase compared to what would be standard new construction for any of them. And just that was all offset by associated rebates of about 5%, which mostly came from Xcel Energy. And so we're really talking about a 2 to 3% increase in cost. And I'll get to it in a little bit, but from the 62% reduction in utilities, And considering the investment is in building envelopes, which means that they kind of have a permanent or 100-year lifespan, they're going to go on into perpetuity. The insulation doesn't necessarily degrade like a geothermal mechanical system would. And so the return on investment is kind of into perpetuity and pays itself off in just a year or two, or maybe 2 or 3 years at tops. Financing, people wonder, how do we do this project? And so in short, we used about $2.35 million in traditional financing. We had to fundraise, and this is one part of this project that was different. We fundraised through corporate gifts, through individual donors, through kind of anybody and everybody. And then we had a lot of discounts to some of the rebates I talked about. We financed this locally with a really great partner in Merchants Bank, which is kind of regionally throughout Southeast Minnesota. They were a fantastic partner in understanding our ambition for the project. They understood kind of the nuance that was a little bit on the cutting edge of some design and hard to model out, and yet had a lot of trust in CAC strength to pull this off. And so Merchants Bank was our financing partner and still is. Fundraising, I just threw up this mess of a picture because really we have much more of an army of small donors rather than 1 or 2 large gifts that made this possible. And then just from the discounts and rebates, we had some land, a small parcel of land to make the site work from Sheldon, which is a local employer. Xcel Energy provided a lot of the rebates. Novel Energy provided some discount on the solar installation, and the city of Northfield provided both some reduction in fees and then a modest $250,000 forgivable loan for pulling off some of the affordable housing components of the project. And so this is like one way to talk about it. I'm more than happy to talk about kind of the pro forma in more detail if people have questions, but it's hard because we were using multiple kind of rated tiers for people, but there's from $0 a month up to about $1,000 a month for a 1-bedroom. Again, these are based on fair median, fair market rate from HUD is just a benchmark we're using. We're not stuck to it. But we try to really have a diverse mix of people who are living there. So we kind of have 3 or 4 rental tiers. One thing, again, we just include all heat, electric, trash, water, and high-speed internet as part of that package to make sure people have access to utilities. And at this point, we've kind of just claimed high-speed internet as one of those. I will say our application process was really interesting. We turned over the application process of both writing the criteria for it and selecting tenants to our participants who access resources at CAC. So our clients or our participants met with our property manager and wrote and drafted what this looked like, and then had a committee that looked through anonymous applications and helped select who got prioritized in terms of applications to the property. And again, the idea of turning power over to the people who typically are on the other side of some of these housing instability challenges was one, again, really important component of ours of how we do our work. And I think this last point just being that the monthly rent roll is designed just to cover operating costs, any internal subsidies, right? So for some of the income revenue generating rent tiers subsidizes the lower rent tiers. And then funds our capital reserve to make sure we're taking care of the buildings in the long run. There's no other profit made because we're a nonprofit, and yet that helps the whole program stay both sustainable, but intentionally invest in the long-term needs of the capital improvements that are going to be needed on that site. And then just similarly, all revenues stay with the project. I do want to just highlight the cost at this point is about $240 per year for all heat and electric for each tenant, which if you think about, many of you and me are paying more than that per month. And so just how these savings work when you build all of it as a one designed development works really well to pass all of these savings on to the people who are calling it home. I'm going to end here with just a shout out that on some next steps, CAC is specifically, we've been awarded a grant to partner locally in Rochester with the Rochester Area Foundation. We're super excited. I think I saw Jeff Urban on this call and Justin Voss with First Homes, but we're really excited about sharing our knowledge with anybody and everybody. This was a first project for us. We certainly went through a lot of lumps along the way and a lot of learning process, and both stumbled and found success. And so we're interested in how we share these experiences. We want other communities to be able to build and change the building landscape to embrace this environmental idea around how actually building environmentally sustainable is affordable rather than a dichotomy of choosing either or. And so super excited about our opportunity to kind of consult and work alongside and share some of our partnerships with the Rochester Area Foundation on some of their projects and looking at how they can incorporate some of these designs. And certainly from a Rochester base, you're more than welcome, I'm assuming, to reach out to RAF to talk about how you might support some of their efforts in doing that and how you can help prioritize some of these environmental ideas and net zero energy construction ideas in their future projects. And so with that, Lauren, Kevin, I can turn it over to you and go from there.
Thank you so much. We do have one question in the chat to kick us off and get us started, but I would encourage others to either put additional questions in the chat or feel free to raise your hand or come off mute as well. To start here, how is the varying energy use or demands of individual residents accounted for in the net zero equation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that, to be honest, is going to be determined. We prioritized at the start of the project in the sense that we were so far on the kind of cutting edge, leading edge of this, to use a lot of modeling and data to project what energy use would be. And then we are charging utilities to the tenants based on those projections of what balancing out what expected use should be from each tenant, what the production from our solar array should be, and then wherever deficiencies there are. Over time, our plan is to start assessing the actual data on this. And so having individually, CAC currently, there's only 1 meter from Excel on the site. And so CAC owns the electric infrastructure internal to the development. And so we're privately metering individual units just for like red flags from our standpoint. But then as leases are renewed in the years to come, we will start attaching kind of projected actuals and then making sure tenants are both informed on their actual usage, and then how we kind of model out the financing on that will be dialed in. Again, we started with, we want to present consistency of an approach for our tenants so that that instability that might start is really a development issue. We felt that was our responsibility, but then in the long run, the direct connection with an individual tenant's usage is something we feel people should have access and knowledge of. And then how that impacts the finances. Again, that'll be prioritized in year 2 and year 3 in terms of lease ups.
Great, thanks, Scott.
Any others with questions?
I have one, Scott. Thanks again for this presentation and how well you outlined kind of your whole process and how you thought about it. It's super compelling. I guess I'm left here struck by all of the amazing things you're able to accomplish as part of this. So I'm curious, just on your own personal feeling, like what are you most proud of? Like what are the things that you're taking away from this project that yeah, you're proud of and excited about?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I didn't name it, but in the graph that shows our growth, the giant spike is obviously COVID, which is about the timeline when we started fundraising for this project. And so kind of our triple dip in terms of needs impacting our community members while trying to take on an ambitious project while growing kind of triple hit us. The thing I'm most proud of, I think, is that we got ourselves out of the center of the project at some point. And we created like shared core principles for everybody. And I think one thing that happened early on in our starting to push was we ended up, and I'm going to say something that's going to feel a little crass, but this is the reality of what we felt, is that as we pushed for some environmental design, we had some, multi-generation builders who were saying, you granola eaters kind of just want to do this, unsustainable stuff. And then we had some environmental people kind of complaining at, the building community is never willing to change and they're just stuck in their ways. And we were able to kind of universalize it and actually take it to a local, like, this is this person and this is this person. So we had Steve Schmidt, who owns Schmidt Homes, talking to Martha, who's the director of sustainability at Carlton at some point. And then it became a personal conversation. And our ability to kind of let people, and it took time and it wasn't efficient and it took some really hard conversations at some point, but that we allowed them to kind of co-learn together so that both had a chance to share and change their perspective. I mean, you can clearly like draw a parallel to, politics in that same 2020, 2019 to 2023 timeframe of polarizing conversations. And yet we're able to find a lot of common ground. And then there were a lot of moments where CAC had to really just put a stake in the ground for some either potential fundraising efforts or grantors who were not interested in our environmental approach. And we had to just say, I'm sorry, this is our priority. It's the needs of our community, and we're not willing to compromise. And some of those unwilling to compromise moments were definitely the hardest, that left you with a stomachache in the middle of the night, because what if the project doesn't work because of these principles? And yet the kind of wherewithal to ride that for 3+ years to the point where we have a project that's working and functioning as it was designed is something that I think is giving a lot of people inspiration to think, oh, this can be done and it's actually done. It's not just an academic exercise anymore.
Certainly giving us inspiration. Oh, thank you.
We do have another question in the chat here. How is on-site waste handled? Have you addressed any personal transportation needs with the housing?
Yes, and not in a way that I feel like is a core part of the success of this project. And so we've navigated and looked at and added some infrastructure on like EV car charging stations. The reality is we looked at the near-term investment for the people we were prioritizing living out there. There just wasn't a mainstream market to make EV cars widely going to be present there. But we did install the infrastructure and kind of stubbed in and modeled out all of our electrical engineering so that we could add one at a much lower cost when we're ready. And so that's how we approach that. From a waste perspective, we at this point are operating in the traditional way of having a centralized contract with waste management. We've looked at different kind of on-site gardening options or composting, and we have some emerging kind of entities in the Northfield area doing some of that work, but that's not infrastructured into the development at this point. And we have run out of space to some extent to kind of have some on-site, any other on-site amenities.
Another question from the chat here. I believe you said that resident applications are anonymous. How did you think about the application process and providing equity to groups who are discriminated against in other traditional housing situations?
Yeah, so that's where we were really intentional about the way CAC is structured. I mentioned that we have like our participants do a lot of our, well, they exclusively hire our staff. From that work, we've developed what we call an advocacy council. So they're current and past participants who access resources at CAC that have kind of emerged as leaders in our work, and they kind of inform a lot of programming and other things. They actually took on both writing the application process, and which includes reviewing like criminal backgrounds and like who gets prioritized and who doesn't, what are exclusionary infractions, and kind of deprioritizing past evictions related to rent payments. And so they wrote all these policies, which specifically, again, our participants who are writing this have experienced housing instability. Some of them are experiencing homelessness currently. It's an extremely diverse population. I think 90% of our advocacy councils identifies as BIPOC. And so their lived experience around that informed how we did that. The anonymous part came in because we're at some point a small town, applications coming in, most people know each other. And so we had to anonymize or take off names or redact kind of identifying information so that then our advocacy council could review those applications with some objectivity. And then we, again, kind of just let them drive the experience around what makes sense of creating a safe community and yet providing a lot of second and third chances for people. And they took a lot of progressive stances around timelines before something would be considered no longer relevant. But then they drew some hard lines around certain background issues around sexual misconduct or violence. And yet, again, kind of like an eviction is not just an eviction, it's a type of eviction that they prioritize, and kind of going to the qualitative stories side of this type of thing. And so turning the power over to them allowed the process to work in a way that was much more accessible for people who had typically been discriminated against in these housing scenarios. The last thing I would point out, and I think it's important, because this is community funded, it is not government funded project, we have so much more flexibility. And so currently, like one of the needs that's been identified from our law enforcement partners is like a post-treatment kind of landing space for people coming out of treatment after substance abuse. And so we have like a short-term kind of stay unit that's prioritized for that. Again, flexible for the needs of the community. We're able to not go through traditional application processes that require social security numbers and some of those things for people who may not have the right documentation. And so it provides a lot more flexibility for us to make those decisions rather than funded by Minnesota Housing or some type of state or federal agency. There's a lot more flexibility internally for us.
I was just going to add that we were real excited here at the coalition, at the foundation, to work with Scott, and we're hoping to do is, pick a project that'll be replicable. So we could take a home design, a townhome design on one of the projects that we're looking at doing in the next 12 months or so, and hopefully, do that a number of times. So Scott and his team, the University of Minnesota sustainability folks, will kind of model some options. So we'll take a plan and then we'll look at the different ways to build it. And so I'm hoping that we can leverage what they're doing. And Scott's been fantastic to actually apply for the grant and just help us out. So thank you for that. And hopefully we can do a little baby spinoff of what you've done up there locally here.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great working with you on this.
Kind of off of that, Scott, could you maybe touch on some of the plans? Some of the other boards and commissions that I sit on and we've seen your work come to, to kind of create documents or ways that this work could be replicated in other communities, kind of what your plan or next steps are in that space?
Yeah, I would say this is, not to always go back to the mess of the nonlinear thing. There's a lot, we've been an open book in terms of sharing documents, right? And yet, as you can see from our process, having a set of blueprints and then building it is not actually quite the whole story, right? And the community engagement piece, from addressing NIMBY to having the people in and around the future development have a voice in the development. And all of those different things are kind of a core part of, yes, we fundraise, but we fundraise because people believed in it, because people had a chance to be in part of it, and people had the chance to get educated around affordable housing, shelter, environmental sustainability pieces. And so that engagement piece needs to our opinion is needs to saddle along this. And so we've been actively sharing this type of presentation and conversation in depth, or kind of more of a summary with communities throughout southern Minnesota. And then like with the Rochester Area Foundation, we're sharing plans, prints, specs, any of those types of things. But our real plan is to we're going to spend the next year kind of assessing the accuracy of the models at Hillcrest. And so we have a kind of partnership, a growing partnership with the University of Minnesota and the Institute on the Environment around actually putting sensors in Hillcrest to kind of really data track what is the usage of utilities and how does it compare to the modeling. And then where are some of the changes we would do if somebody else or we did it again. And so how we incorporate those changes and learning then become a package that we would share much more broadly. But for now, it's a one-off. Like if people want to talk or assist or look at any of our specifications or designs or blueprints, we are more than happy to share those.
Got another question for you. So it seemed that the Hillcrest development was in somewhat of a suburban setting. Do you see some of the same principles or processes you went through with Hillcrest being applicable to greater density projects in urban or semi-urban areas, say low-rise 3 to 4 story apartment complex, things of that nature?
Yeah, I think actually, in terms of return on investment, it just kind of grows from a density perspective. I think the needs of the community drive a lot more of the density decision making, right? So if you're looking at infill, how does that look? Yes, you're right. Ours is, our unit was on the kind of edge of town, but redeveloping a kind of dilapidated site. And we did prioritize space a little bit more than I think a scenario that needs higher density would do. But the lessons learned from the specifics of how we constructed our walls and invested in the building envelope, but even the lesson learned around the idea and payback for new construction to prioritize building envelope investment and design and modeling and that environmental architecture perspective. If they could work at our rural duplex scale, they only get better at a denser, 40 unit building perspective. And so it would almost be I would be more worried the other way if you were telling me we did this on this, 112 unit building. I don't know if we could do it at our level, but our level kind of inherently proves the point at a bigger scale, if that makes sense. I think some of the financing and other things become different questions, right? Like our fundraising component is a very unique perspective of ours, and yet from like a actual market rate, I think you can actually get pretty close pretty quickly. And if there's any incentives from city, public, foundation level on these capital builds, I think you get there actually relatively quickly. Seth,
So
does that help answer your question? You can ask more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And ways I have lots of questions, but you approach this from the standpoint of a nonprofit. Do you see a path towards incentivizing this type of development from a for-profit development standpoint, or do you think that nonprofit aspect of the developer is really a key part of the puzzle?
I would say from the community engagement part, the neutralizing agent that was CAC was really important. I just think about getting 3 competitive builders in a room to price share. There's a dance in there that is not natural, right? And so that's one issue. I think the actual pro forma side of drawing a profit from this, if you were to enter the TIF financing space and you're looking at limited units being like a smaller percentage being affordable, I don't actually have any concern that this can be done. And part of it's just taking, again, at our least efficient, least dense level, if we're looking at a 7 to 8% increase in cost, you're looking at a less of a percent increase in cost if you get on a bigger scale. And then you're looking at the 5% rebate from Excel, I mean, currently is still there, right? I mean, that's a laborious process and has its own challenges and, isn't always going to be dependable. But for now, that offset of 2 to 3% is instant. And so between the cost versus savings. And so to make up that cost and increase rents at a market rate with some TIF financing to provide some of the affordable side, I think the pro forma gets there really quick from a profitability standpoint for a private interest group to champion.
That's great. As others have echoed, wonderful project. And thank you so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, the one thing that indirectly addresses your question, maybe some other questions people might be having. So for our standpoint, we had 3 builders. The main builder built 3 units. There were 3 duplexes. So everybody built a single building type. So they built 3 duplexes. Our second builder built 2 quadplexes, and our third builder built 1 triplex. Comparing the narratives of their postmortem is fascinating, in line with what you'd expect. The builder who built the 1 triplex, right? That was a challenge. I had to learn a lot. We kind of stumbled through it, had to make a lot of corrective actions on assessments and evaluations and inspections around little installation details and stuff. Makes sense. The builder who built 3, same exact story on the first unit. Second unit was like, that was kind of hard, but we kind of got it down. And by the third one, the narrative is basically we could do that the same as any other project. It just took 2 buildings to learn it. And so the other side of this is, yes, that'll be hard for a private interest builder in their first go. If you could incentivize that, their ability to replicate that and build that way into the future should be, to be honest, again, from a nonprofit executive director, so what do I know? But that's an extremely marketable, profitable endeavor to master and learn in the coming decades of new construction around affordable housing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Any other final questions or comments for Scott? All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again, Scott, for presenting. It is, again, just to echo everyone's comments, a really wonderful project. It's great to see all the partnerships that went into it, and I'm excited to see some of that happen here in Rochester as well. So looking forward to next steps for how you all continue to share the work that was done there in Northfield. And with that, we'll close out this month's sustainability series, and we will follow up and share the recording and slides and materials with everyone as well. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your Wednesday, everyone.